The criminal case of Jesus Christ versus the United States of America. This could be the most outrageous story that you've never heard. Listen and learn all about the criminal trial of the man who claimed that he was the Son of God. Today, you will finally hear the facts, the truth, the evidence, and the unbelievable outcome of this case. This is one story that you don't want to miss or hear about secondhand. This is the story of a man who came from nowhere. After a careful review of all the information about him, he never wants to mention to anyone exactly where he was from. When asked, he would simply say that his father sent him. Witnesses for the prosecution would later testify that he was born in Hoboken, New Jersey, to an unidentified man and a mother who died from a drug overdose. The story begins on a day in July when a man named William Smith was shooting video on the beats of Lake Michigan. William just happened to notice and film what appeared to be a man walking on top of the water. It looked like a man was walking on the water to retrieve a toy for a crying child, a toy that had probably been carried out into deeper waters by the waves. William immediately uploaded his video to the internet. Not surprisingly, it went viral. Suddenly, this mystery man was all over the web, and people had dubbed him the Water Walker. This would not be the last time that the mysterious man would be captured on video. He was also seen standing on street corners telling anyone who would listen that they needed to turn away from their sins. Some wondered if he was a preacher of some sort, but if he was an unusual one, because he didn't have a soapbox, microphone, or even a megaphone set up. He just stood in one place and spoke quietly to whomever walked past him. He spoke only about saving their souls. In the beginning, few took him seriously, but this was something to change. One day, he was interviewed by a fame-seeking reporter.
Press 1 to enter the conference.
At one point in the interview, the reporter asked, "Who are you really?" His answer shocked both the reporter and the viewing audiences. In response to the question, he calmly, and as a matter of fact, he said, "I am Jesus Christ, and I've come to save the world." Many people who watched the video got angry. They were offended that this man who walked the streets of Chicago claimed to be the Son of God. A few days later, another video popped up on the news channels. His new video showed him once again walking on water, but he was not retrieving a child's toy this time. This time, he was rescuing a drowning man. This time, the video wasn't shaky amateur footage. This was recorded by a professional news crew, and it was eyewitnessed by a small crowd of people. This would be the event that cemented his place in the national and global spotlight. The mystery man who called himself Jesus now had all eyes on him. The internet created memes of the mysterious Jesus and made countless jokes about him. They called him names like the Water Magician and the Hobo Savior. News stations were curious about his feats, so they interviewed famous big-name magicians. They asked how such an illusion could be created. All the magicians gave their plausible, scientific-sounding explanations. They said with the right training, just about anyone could perform such a feat. Jesus was an overnight curiosity and laughingstock. Usually, internet sensations rise and fall rather quickly, but not this one. It appeared that Jesus was here and he wasn't going anywhere soon, not just yet anyway. Jesus began visiting the larger churches in the city. He'd ask the preachers question after question about their messages, their riches, and their lifestyles. He openly criticized them, and in doing so caused violent outbursts among the church members. Some of the church members were arrested for assault on Jesus. Jesus continued to visit different churches and publicly challenged their leaders. And as the hostility toward this man grew among the church folk, so did the number of people that followed him. The press also began following him, eager and curious to see what he would do next. Several days passed and the press decided to interview Jesus. They asked him why. Why are you doing this? On live TV, he said that all he wanted was for mankind to follow him so that they could be saved. In the span of 6 short days, this man who called himself Jesus Christ had brought division to this great nation. While some found him entertaining and harmless, others considered him dangerous and sacrilegious. But he continued to do amazing things. He visited hospitals where he, so-called, healed critically ill people. He even appeared to bring a dead man back to life. There were those who were filled with anger that he would dare to call himself the fleshly manifestation of their God. This man slept on park benches at night or in the homes of those who befriended him. Once he was given a fish and a loaf of bread as a joke, but when he broke the bread and divided the fish and generated enough food to feed the massive crowd of curiosity seekers, people got even angrier. The man named Jesus began to grow in popularity, then suddenly the media frenzy that surrounded him ceased. It was as if, by a single order, they had all stopped sharing the news of this man who caused himself Jesus. After a mere 26 days since his first sighting, Jesus was arrested. He was charged with the rape of a 13-year-old male. Police took him into custody as he was preaching to a large crowd. The news reported that Jesus was being charged with several terrible crimes. Eyewitnesses appeared with so-called evidence against him. His trial made headlines which read, "The criminal Son of God goes to trial." He was back on every channel, but his words were now edited, taken out of context. When his trial began, information about his past suddenly appeared from nowhere. The media now painted him as a lifelong criminal. They said he spent his youth in and out of reformatories. People came forth reporting having seen him in drunken orgies with children. They said he would call himself Jesus when he was high on crack. His supporters provided alibis for Jesus. These supporters were threatened. Some lost their jobs, some lost their homes, and others met with horrible accidents until there was no one left. Large crowds gathered outside the court building during the trial. The National Guard was called out to maintain the peace. The judge ordered Jesus to be gagged whenever he entered the courtroom. The court of public opinion weighed heavily against Jesus. Some still silently believed in Jesus until the prosecution dropped their bombshell. They produced a birth certificate which named this man Harvey Engelston. They presented as evidence the remains of a 6-year-old girl who had been assaulted, mutilated, and partially eaten by the man they called Jesus. There were plenty of witnesses, photographs, and DNA evidence to convict Jesus. When the public heard this news, the crowd of supporters slowly disappeared. Soon it seemed that no one was on the side of the man who called himself Jesus. The newspapers called it the most heinous crime in United States history. There was public outcry for a speedy and harsh execution of this man. This was a man the prosecutor said was a monster who spit in the face of God and all his true believers. Televisions were constantly airing angry politicians, celebrities, and religious leaders calling for Jesus' head on a stick. It turns out that this was not a figurative demand that they were making. At the trial's ending, the jury announced that they needed no deliberation. He was immediately found guilty and sentenced to die. Due to the vile and monstrous nature of his crimes, the judge demanded that his execution be speedy and without mercy in the name of the people. In a short 24 hours, Jesus' life on this earth would be coming to an end. The next day, something very unusual happened. A dirty and obviously beaten Jesus was escorted and marched from his holding cell to the execution chamber, right through the middle of the downtown streets for all the public to see. Angry mobsters lined the streets. They hurled objects at him. Beer bottles, cans, rocks, and sticks pummeled him as he walked. People broke through the police barricades. They ran up to him and kicked and punched him. They punched him hard. They knocked him to the ground again and again. After being knocked down and trying to get to his feet, a child ran up to him and spat directly in his face. The crowd roared their approval for the brave child's actions. This man named Jesus, though beaten and bloody, continued to limp forward in accordance with his handler's shouted orders. Strangely enough, nobody seemed to notice that not once had this man cried out for mercy. Nor did he curse his accusers or the violent, angry mob. In fact, his expression only reflected what looked like sadness. Then, without warning, the crowd suddenly parted and a group of men wearing all black emerged from the opening in the crowd. These large men were carrying a huge wooden cross. Jesus was ordered to halt as the men laid the heavy cross upon his back. As they kicked him and ordered him to carry the cross, the crowd began chanting, "Carry your cross, Jesus, carry your cross," and he did. As this procession moved to within 1 block of the execution house, Jesus' path was suddenly redirected. They were now heading toward Holy Mary Park, which lined directly in front of Calvary Church of Christ. The rabid crowd arrived at the park cheering as the beaten and bloody man called Jesus stood in the middle of the park, which would be his final destination. Then the large men wearing all black took the cross and planted it into the earth, and at the direction of more unidentified suited men, one of the men grabbed Jesus' bloody hand and nailed it to the wooden cross. The crowd seemed to be intoxicated by the violence and the hateful energy that filled the air. Jesus' other hand was nailed into place on this death cross. Then finally, his feet felt the brutal sting of the spike that would hold them in place. Then the cross was lifted up, and the crowd cheered wildly. They were in such a frenzy that fights broke out among them for no apparent reason. They seemed to find a deep, almost spiritual satisfaction in seeing this human being badly beaten and completely covered in his own blood. The pandemonium was punctuated by their witnessing of the clown Jesus being crucified in front of the church that he recently visited and tried to convince the leaders and followers to turn away from their sinful ways. Some people in the crowd laughed while others continued to pelt him with whatever objects they could find, including shoes. And still others simply yelled and screamed. The noise was deafening. One could hardly hear the sounds of the helicopters that circled overhead. They were there to provide live coverage of this event to news stations worldwide. This was indeed a joyous occasion for the people. And then something happened that caught everyone off guard. So Jesus had truly endured a vicious, no-holds-barred attack today. A non-distinct man from the crowd ran up and rammed a pole or spear into his side. This man who called himself Jesus, who claimed that he only wanted to save the world, winced in pain. People in the crowd stared with their mouths agape as they watched what appeared to be water flowing from the wound. While in the crowd were confused expressions, maybe they thought their eyes were simply playing tricks on them. Maybe they believed this to be the final trick for this pretender magician. One can only wonder about the various thoughts in the minds of that vast crowd. One would only have a brief moment to wonder because the skies quickly began to darken. And with this change of the daytime skies, so too did the looks on the faces of the once ravenous crowd. This came a rapidly forming storm, a storm of intense magnitude and power. The winds of this storm howled, bending trees and pushing smaller members of the crowd off their feet. Then came the rains, which fell and dropped so large that they caused pain upon impact with the now fleeing crowd. This storm of storms reached violent and dangerous levels in under a minute's time. The crowd barely had a chance to move from their places when the earth itself started to shake. It began with a tremble, which caused the masses to shudder. You could hear screams and wailing throughout the crowd. Within seconds, the tremble had intensified into an angry shaking of the earth. Buildings began to crack at their foundations. The earth began to crack, and many of the onlookers were quickly swallowed up into the deep crevices. Others fled to their homes. They closed their doors, fell to their knees, and prayed. They prayed for protection, they prayed for their family's safety, and some prayed for forgiveness. One almost has to wonder, what kind of people would commit such a vile act and what kind of God would forgive it?